Elian finds a wounded alien beneath the city. A discovery that will change everything. What if love wasn't bound to a heart that beats like ours? What if it came from a place so far beyond what we can even imagine? Would you be able to recognize it? Could you fall for something or someone so different, so alien, that everything you've ever known feels small by comparison? Imagine standing on the edge of the unknown, looking at the stars and wondering if they might hold answers to the questions that keep you awake at night. Then, one night, you hear a voice that isn't human, calling your name, asking for your trust. At first, you think it's a dream. But then, you feel it. The connection. The pull. You know in your bones that something beyond your understanding is happening. That is the moment when you realize, love doesn't need to fit inside the lines we draw. It doesn't need to follow the rules. But can it survive, when the one you love isn't human? Can it survive across galaxies, against everything that's been told to you? What would you do if the love you've always been searching for, doesn't belong to this world? This is a story of two souls, one human, one alien whose love defies the very fabric of reality. This isn't just about love. It's about survival. It's about choice. And it's about whether or not they can defy everything to be together, or if the universe itself will tear them apart. Stay with me till the end. This story isn't over yet. And trust me, it's only just beginning. If you think you've seen it all, you've only scratched the surface. Make sure to hit subscribe right now. You're about to embark on a journey that will question everything, and you'll want to be part of Intergalactic Hearts when it unfolds. Lyra had never thought she'd end up on a place like this. The world around her was unlike anything she had ever seen. The sky was thick, covered in a rusty haze, casting a shadow over the ruins beneath. The air felt heavy, thick with dust and a strange energy. She stepped out of her ship, feeling the ground beneath her, a planet so far from home, so unfamiliar. The city around her seemed lifeless. People moved without purpose, walking past her as if she didn't exist. It was as though she was invisible. She wasn't like them. She was something different. A visitor. A stranger. An outsider. Her heart began to race with each step. The weight of her presence here, in this foreign land, was starting to sink in. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had been sent to Earth for a reason, a mission, but nothing about it felt right. Her people had been destroyed by the Empire, and now she had been cast into the chaos that was this world. She had no choice but to endure. She had to survive. And then, she saw him. His presence was striking, drawing her attention without effort. He stood amidst the crowd, the bustling masses of humanity, but his eyes, those eyes cut through the noise like a beacon. Elian. He wasn't like anyone she had seen before. His build was strong, his posture firm. His deep green eyes locked with hers from across the street, and for a brief second, time seemed to stand still. Their gazes met and everything else faded into the background. "You're not from around here, are you?" His voice was smooth, carrying a calm that made her feel uneasy in its simplicity. Lyra hesitated, her thoughts racing. Her alien instincts told her to be cautious, to distrust him. But for some reason, she felt something stir within her. It was as if she recognized him somehow. As if their fates had already intertwined in ways she didn't yet understand. "I'm not," she replied, her voice steady but filled with something else, something unspoken. The brief silence between them was heavy. Their eyes locked again, a brief moment of recognition, of curiosity. And for the first time since arriving on this foreign planet, Lyra felt something. A small pull, a connection. Unexplainable, but undeniable. Elian was used to seeing strangers. It was part of his job walking through crowds of people, taking the occasional glance at someone unfamiliar, and moving on. But this was different. When he first saw her, standing alone in the middle of the street, there was something about her that made him stop in his tracks. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever seen before. Her skin glowed faintly under the dull light of the city. Her long, flowing white hair seemed almost unnatural, and those eyes, those intense, violet eyes stared at him as if they could see right through him. He walked towards her, every step slow and deliberate. He wasn't sure what it was, but something drew him in. There was a pull, an invisible force that made him feel like he couldn't look away, like he needed to know more. "You're lost, aren't you?" Elian asked, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Her eyes scanned him, trying to gauge if he was like the others, just another human to ignore. But no. He wasn't. There was something in his gaze, a depth that made her hesitate. She had to admit, there was something strangely comforting about his presence. "I'm not lost," she finally replied, her tone firm yet guarded. "I'm just trying to survive." Elian raised an eyebrow, a half smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Survival? I know that feeling." He didn't move, watching her with an intensity that made Lyra's heart race, though she didn't show it. She wasn't used to humans looking at her this way. Normally, they were either terrified of her or saw her as a tool, something to be exploited. But Elian? He was different. His gaze didn't feel like an attack. It felt curious. Like he was seeing her for who she truly was, not just what she was. "Survival's the only thing any of us really know, isn't it?" Lyra said softly, stepping forward just slightly. The world felt smaller, the space between them narrowing. Elian nodded, the smirk on his face vanishing into something more thoughtful. "I guess that's one way to put it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lyra's gaze flickered over his body, noting the way his muscles flexed under his clothes, the strength in his build. She couldn't help but notice the way his presence seemed to fill the space, as if he wasn't just a man, but a force of nature. He wasn't tall, but there was something about him that made him seem imposing, even without saying a word. "Where are you from?" Elian finally asked, breaking the silence between them. Lyra tilted her head, considering his question. Should she tell him the truth? About who she was? Where she came from? Or should she lie? She had done so many times before. "Not from around here," she said, her voice steady. "And neither are you you?" Elian chuckled softly. "You could say that. Earth's not exactly my idea of home either." Lyra studied him carefully. She couldn't place it, but there was something in his eyes, something familiar. Perhaps it was the pain she saw lurking there, the same pain that mirrored her own. Maybe that's why she felt this strange, magnetic pull toward him. As if he could sense her thoughts, Elian shifted his stance, his gaze softening. He took a step closer to her. "If you're looking for answers, this city might not be the best place. But if you're looking for someone to show you the way, maybe I can help." Lyra took a small step back, feeling the heat of his proximity, the unspoken invitation in his words. She couldn't understand it, but she was intrigued. Was he offering help out of kindness, or was there something else? "I'm not sure I need your help," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something else: uncertainty. Hope. She couldn't quite place it. Well, you seem like someone who could use a friend, Elian replied, his voice warmer now. And I'm not offering just help. I'm offering understanding. The words hung in the air between them. Lyra didn't know whether to trust him or keep her distance. But something in her, something deep inside, told her to take a chance. Without thinking, she nodded, just a slight movement. Okay, she whispered. Maybe I could use a friend. The days that followed were strange. Lyra had expected the world of Earth to be harsh and unforgiving, and in some ways, it was. But there was something different about Elian. He wasn't like the others. He was kind in a way she hadn't experienced before. He didn't look at her as if she was an alien, something to be feared or studied. No, he looked at her like she was human. At first, it was awkward. The way he tried to help her adapt to this new world. She had never needed help before, she had always been the one doing the saving. But here, she was learning things she had never imagined: how to walk through crowds without standing out, how to blend in, how to speak the language, how to make herself invisible in a sea of humanity. "You're doing it wrong," Elian said one day, as they crouched behind a pile of rusted machinery. They had been practicing how to avoid being detected by the Empire's drones. Lyra gave him a pointed look. "I've been hiding longer than you have. I don't need your advice." Elian raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just trying to save us both from being blown to pieces." His grin was crooked, teasing, but there was a certain warmth in his eyes that made her pause. Despite herself, Lyra chuckled. "I suppose I could use a little help after all." Her words were almost a whisper, but the weight of them hung between them. Elian didn't answer immediately, instead watching her closely as if studying her. She had no idea what he was thinking. He had to be wondering why she, an alien from another world, was now sharing a life with him. Was she just another mission to him? Another job? Or something more? "All right, let's try this again," he said after a moment, a quiet determination in his voice. He gestured for her to follow him as he moved swiftly and silently through the industrial sector. Lyra followed, mimicking his movements, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't the adrenaline of the mission, though. It was something else. Something about being close to him made her feel more alive than she had in a long time. His presence was comforting, even when danger was looming on every side. As they crouched behind a corner, the sound of footsteps grew louder. A group of Empire soldiers passed by, their armored boots echoing against the metal walls. Lyra held her breath, her senses on high alert. But Elian, he was calm. His steady hand found hers, guiding her deeper into the shadows. For a moment, she forgot about everything, about the Empire, the war, the fate of her people. She only felt his touch, the warmth of his hand against hers. And when the soldiers moved past, she exhaled, the tension leaving her body. Elian didn't let go of her hand immediately. "We're safe," he murmured, his voice soft, but with a hint of relief. Lyra turned to face him, her gaze meeting his for a brief, intense moment. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. His courage? His trust? Or was it something else? He didn't answer. Instead, he just smiled, small, genuine, and something more than just a friendly gesture. In that smile, Lyra saw a flicker of something deeper, something she couldn't name. She didn't know what it meant, but it made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. For the first time since arriving on this planet, Lyra allowed herself to feel something that wasn't survival. She allowed herself to feel hope. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Elian had always played it safe. He was a worker, a mechanic, not a hero. He did his job and kept his head down. But now, he was staring at Lyra, who stood in front of him, eyes wide with a mix of fear and trust. She was vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before, and for the first time in his life, Elian felt like he didn't know what to do. The room around them was dark, the only light coming from the flickering screens of the old machinery they had taken refuge in. The Empire was closing in on them. He could hear the distant hum of the soldiers' footsteps. It was only a matter of time before they would find them. And yet, in this moment, with Lyra standing there, he didn't feel the fear. All he felt was an overwhelming need to protect her. "Why are you doing this?" Lyra asked again, her voice shaky. Her eyes, usually filled with confidence, were now full of doubt. "You don't know me. You don't know what I am. What if I'm just a tool, a weapon? What if I'm dangerous?" Elian's heart ached at her words. He had never seen someone so broken, so unsure of themselves. He stepped closer to her, his boots silent against the metal floor. His hand reached out to gently lift her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You're not dangerous, Lyra," Elian said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "You're not a weapon. He paused, his eyes searching hers. "You're more than that. And I'm not going to let them turn you into one." Lyra flinched at his touch, as though she wasn't used to being treated with such tenderness. She pulled back slightly, looking away, as if afraid to let him see the vulnerability that was quickly becoming too much for her to hide. Elian's heart thudded in his chest. He wanted to say more, to comfort her, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he closed the distance between them and took her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, there was no need for words. Their hands fit together like they were always meant to. "We need to get out of here," Lyra said after a long pause, her voice firm again. But Elian could hear the shakiness beneath her resolve. "Yeah," Elian agreed, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "But not without you." They didn't have much time. The sound of footsteps was getting closer. Elian's mind raced, but all he could think about was getting her to safety. There was a strange sense of urgency in him, an urgency that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with her. "Stay close to me," Elian said, his voice low, his hand still gripping hers. "I won't let them hurt you." Lyra nodded, her breath quickening as they made their way through the dark corridors. Every step they took felt like a countdown, each moment more precious than the last. Suddenly, they heard voices ahead. Elian's grip on her hand tightened. "We have to move faster," he whispered urgently. But as they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a group of Empire soldiers. Lyra froze, her breath catching in her throat. Elian immediately stepped in front of her, his body blocking hers from view. His mind raced. They had no weapons, no chance of fighting their way out. But they had something more. They had each other. Without a second thought, Elian reached into his pocket, pulling out a small device he had stolen from the Empire's tech vault. It was a simple EMP generator, just enough to knock out the soldiers' equipment for a few seconds. "On my mark," he whispered, his fingers tightening around the device. Lyra nodded silently, her eyes never leaving the soldiers. As Elian activated the device, a flash of light filled the corridor, followed by the unmistakable sound of weapons short-circuiting. The soldiers stumbled, momentarily stunned. It was enough time for them to move. Elian pulled Lyra forward, urging her to run. They didn't look back as they sprinted through the darkened halls, heartbeats thudding in their chests, the sound of their footsteps drowned out by the chaos around them. For a brief moment, everything was quiet. They had made it out of the immediate danger, at least. But the tension between them was palpable, heavier than ever. "I don't know what happens next," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper as they slowed to a stop in a dark alley. Her hand was still clutched tightly in his. Elian looked at her, his eyes searching hers for answers. He didn't have them. But he knew one thing. "I'm not letting you go, Lyra," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "Not now. Not ever." The night stretched on in oppressive silence as Lyra and Elian made their way deeper into the heart of the city. They moved carefully, staying in the shadows, avoiding the patrols. Every sound felt amplified in the stillness. Lyra's mind was racing, the weight of everything she had learned pressing on her. She had thought she knew who she was, but now everything had changed. The past, the Empire, her people, it was all a lie. Elian noticed the way she was acting, distant, almost cold. He had seen her vulnerable before, but this was different. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was broken. And it hurt him to see her like that. He didn't know how to fix it, but he knew he had to try. "Lyra," he called quietly, stopping in their tracks. "What's going on? You're not yourself." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she didn't speak. She couldn't. Her chest tightened with the weight of the truth she had yet to tell him. She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Elian, there's something you need to know. About me." He was silent, watching her closely, waiting for her to continue. He could see the conflict in her eyes. The vulnerability that she was desperately trying to hide. "I'm not just some survivor," Lyra said, her words barely audible. "I'm not even just an alien. I was created by the Empire. I wasn't born. I was made." Elian's eyes widened, his chest tightening as the implications of her words sank in. He stepped closer, reaching out for her hand, but she pulled back before he could touch her. She wasn't ready for that. "Not yet. They experimented on me," she continued, her voice trembling. "I was bred to be their weapon. A tool to control the others. To be perfect. They took everything from me, my family, my past, even my identity." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly, not wanting to appear weak. She wasn't weak. She couldn't afford to be. Elian didn't know what to say. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he could feel the distance between them widening. How could he understand? How could he possibly comprehend the pain of losing everything, of being forced into a life you never asked for? But even as he struggled for the right words, his gaze softened. There was a raw honesty in her confession, something that felt like a breaking point. He could see it now, how fragile she was beneath the surface. "You're not a weapon, Lyra," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not what they made you. You're more than that." Her laugh was bitter, a hollow sound that made his heart ache. "You don't understand. I was created for this. To fight. To kill. That's all I was supposed to be. But, you make me feel like I'm something more. Something human. Elian stepped forward, his hand gently brushing her cheek. He could see the pain in her eyes, the rawness of everything she had been through. He didn't have answers. But he had something else. He had her. You are more, he whispered, his voice soft, yet filled with certainty. I see you, Lyra. All of you. For a long moment, they stood there, the space between them charged with the unspoken truth that had been growing between them all this time. Lyra wasn't just a weapon. She was a person. A person who had been broken by the Empire's cruelty, but who was still standing. I don't know if I can believe that, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Not yet. But I want to. I want to believe that I can be more than what they made me. Elian nodded, his fingers gently tilting her chin so that she had no choice but to look at him. You don't have to be alone in this, he said. I'll help you find out who you really are. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself anymore. A small flicker of hope sparked in her chest. It was fragile, like a dying ember, but it was there. For the first time, she thought maybe just maybe she could have something more than the pain of her past. And in that moment, something changed between them. The bond they shared deepened, and Lyra felt herself letting go, just a little, of the weight she had been carrying all this time. The night passed in uneasy silence, both of them resting in the shadows of the city's forgotten alleyways. But the quiet did nothing to ease the tension that had been growing between them since Lyra's confession. Elian lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling above them, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Lyra had been created by the Empire, molded into something designed to obey, to fight. It was a truth that twisted in his gut. He couldn't imagine being forced into such a life. Yet, here she was fighting, surviving, and choosing to fight back against everything the Empire had made her. He turned his head to look at her, still asleep, her features soft and unguarded in the dim light. The faint purple hue of her skin glowed ever so slightly in the darkness, a reminder that she was far from human. Yet, in the quiet of this moment, she seemed more real to him than anyone else. And then, something unexpected happened. As if feeling his gaze, Lyra stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked several times, disoriented, before her gaze met his. Her eyes, those bright violet eyes, held something soft and vulnerable that Elian hadn't seen before. Couldn't sleep, she asked, her voice rough from sleep. No, he replied softly, his gaze never leaving hers. Too much on my mind. She sat up slightly, her movement graceful despite the exhaustion in her body. We've been running for days. Your mind's probably in overdrive. Elian chuckled softly. I guess you could say that. There was a beat of silence between them, the air heavy with words left unsaid. Lyra seemed to hesitate before speaking again. Elian, I want to thank you. Her voice was soft, sincere. For everything. For not running. For not looking at me like I'm just some weapon. The words hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't used to hearing gratitude from her, not after everything she'd been through. And yet, here she was, offering it so freely. You don't have to thank me, he said quietly. I'm just doing what feels right. She smiled faintly at that, the expression almost sad. I don't know what's right anymore, she said, her eyes distant, as though thinking of something far away. Elian reached over, placing a hand gently on hers. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. You don't have to figure it all out now, Lyra. We've got time. Together, we'll figure it out. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something deeper than just the bond of allies. It was the unmistakable tension of unspoken feelings, something between them that neither of them had acknowledged yet. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, they heard it, a distant sound that froze them both. The unmistakable hum of approaching Imperial forces. Their presence was close, too close. Lyra's instincts kicked in. She stood immediately, her eyes scanning the surroundings, looking for an escape route. We don't have much time. Elian's heart raced, adrenaline flooding his system as the familiar feeling of danger settled into his bones. We'll need to move fast. Follow my lead. They didn't waste another second. Elian grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her into the shadows just as the first group of soldiers rounded the corner. The sound of their boots echoed loudly against the metal walls of the alleyway. Lyra's breathing was steady, but Elian could feel her body tense with the anticipation of a fight. Stay close, Elian whispered urgently, his grip firm on her hand as they crouched behind a stack of metal crates. Lyra nodded, her body close to his, their shared proximity almost too much for both of them to handle. Their breath mingled, both of them aware of the other's presence in a way they never had been before. The tension between them was palpable, a quiet battle of emotions waging inside their hearts. The soldiers passed by, oblivious to the two of them hidden in the shadows. It was a close call, and Elian could feel his heart still pounding in his chest. But there was no time to relax. They had to keep moving. He pulled her along, his mind racing through their options. We need to get to the old tunnels under the city, Elian said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. It's our best chance. Lyra nodded, but there was something in her eyes that stopped him. For a brief moment, she turned to him, her gaze searching. Then, she did something unexpected. She stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them until their bodies were almost touching. Elian, her voice was softer than before, more vulnerable. She hesitated, looking up at him. Her hand brushed against his arm, lingering for a second longer than necessary. I'm scared. I've never been this close to someone before, and I don't know what this means. What we're doing. I don't know if I can trust this. Her words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. And then, in the silence, Elian did something he never thought he would. He took her hand and gently pulled her toward him. This isn't just about survival anymore, Elian said, his voice low but filled with certainty. It's about us. We're in this together, Lyra. And whatever happens, I won't leave you behind. For a moment, Lyra seemed to search his face, looking for any hint of doubt. But there was none. She could see it in his eyes. He meant every word. Okay, she whispered, her voice soft. Let's do this. The city was alive with danger. Every corner seemed to hold a threat, every shadow felt like it was hiding something sinister. Lyra and Elian moved through the streets with purpose, their steps quiet but urgent. The weight of what they had just shared still hung in the air, unspoken but understood. It was clear now. They were in this together, no longer just surviving. They had become more than allies, more than just people fighting against a common enemy. The connection between them had evolved, something deeper than either of them had expected. Yet there was no time to dwell on it. The Empire was closing in on them, and every second counted. They made their way toward the old underground tunnels that Elian knew so well, his only hope for escaping the increasingly hostile streets. "You know, if we get caught down here," Lyra said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence, "it's over." Elian glanced at her, his expression serious, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. "We won't get caught. Not if I have anything to say about it." His words were confident, and his plan was clear. But even as he led the way down into the maze of tunnels, a part of him couldn't help but worry. He had always trusted these tunnels, relied on them to escape from danger. But now, things were different. He wasn't just trying to escape the Empire anymore. He was running for both of them. Lyra seemed to sense his hesitation, her voice suddenly softer as they navigated the dark corridors. "Elian, we're not just fighting for our lives anymore. What's happening between us, it's real, isn't it?" Elian's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he stopped moving. He turned to face her, the dim light from the old pipes casting shadows over their faces. "What are you asking, Lyra?" His voice was low, his gaze intense. She met his gaze, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. There were no more walls between them. No more pretending. Just two people standing in the dark, trying to make sense of the emotions that had been building between them for so long. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if it's real, or if it's just a consequence of all the madness around us. But when you look at me like that, when you say those things, it feels real. And that terrifies me." Elian stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm, his fingers grazing her skin as if testing the boundaries between them. "I don't know what this is either, but I'm not afraid of it, Lyra. I can't be." Lyra swallowed hard, the truth of his words sinking in. She had spent so long building walls, burying herself in her mission, in her hatred for the Empire. But now, there was Elian. There was this. The feeling that they could survive this together, not just for survival, but for something more. "I'm not afraid of it either," she whispered. "I'm just scared of losing it." "Losing you?" Elian's heart clenched. He stepped even closer, their faces inches apart. He could feel her breath, warm against his lips, her body close enough that he could sense the subtle tension in her every movement. "You're not going to lose me, Lyra," he said softly, his hand now gently cupping her cheek. "Not ever." The words, simple as they were, carried a weight both of them felt in the silence that followed. There was something about the way they looked at each other, something unspoken, something more than just words. It was the promise of something deeper than anything they had ever known. Their faces drew closer, their lips brushing for the briefest moment. It wasn't a kiss, at least, not yet, but it was a touch so intimate that it made everything else in the world disappear for a fleeting moment. And then, just as quickly as the moment came, it was gone. The sound of footsteps, distant but growing louder, broke through the fragile silence. Elian pulled away reluctantly, his hand still resting on Lyra's arm. "We need to move," he said urgently, but there was something in his voice, a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. Lyra nodded, though her heart was still racing from the brief connection. She couldn't deny it anymore. There was no escaping what was happening between them. And it scared her. But it was also the only thing that made sense in a world that had turned upside down. They continued down the tunnel, the sound of the approaching soldiers echoing in the distance. But this time, Lyra didn't feel alone. For the first time in a long time, she felt like there was someone beside her, someone who truly understood her. And for Elian, as they moved further into the darkness, he knew one thing for certain: no matter what came next, they would face it together. The tension that had been building between Lyra and Elian did not dissipate as they continued down the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the city. Their every step was measured, silent, as they moved toward what they hoped was safety. But the truth was, they both knew they were far from it. The Empire's grip was everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before they would be hunted down. Still, the silence between them carried a weight. It wasn't just the pressure of evading the soldiers that made their hearts race, it was the fact that everything between them was changing. The delicate intimacy of their shared glances, their stolen touches, made the air between them crackle with something more. "I don't know what we're doing anymore, Elian," Lyra said, her voice quiet but heavy with the weight of the words. "I don't know if we're fighting for survival, or if we're just..." She trailed off, unsure of what she was trying to say. Elian turned to her, his eyes soft but steady. "We're fighting for each other," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was a fire behind it that hadn't been there before. "We're fighting for something bigger than ourselves." Lyra glanced up at him, her heart skipping a beat. His words, so sure, so full of conviction, settled over her like a blanket. She didn't know why, but in that moment, everything felt clearer. Maybe it was because they were both trying to survive in a world that didn't understand them, didn't care about them. But together, they were stronger. "Do you really believe that?" Lyra asked, her voice small, as though seeking reassurance. "That we can fight back against everything? Against the Empire? Against what they've done to me?" Elian's grip on her hand tightened, and he pulled her slightly closer, his face just inches from hers. "Yes," he said firmly. "Because I believe in you. I believe in us." His words hit her with a force that made her breath catch in her throat. She couldn't recall a time when someone had looked at her this way, when someone had believed in her so fully, without question. In the world she had known, people didn't believe in her. They feared her, or they used her. But Elian? He saw something in her that no one else did. "You don't have to carry this burden alone," Elian added, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You never did. Not as long as I'm here." For the first time in so long, Lyra allowed herself to believe him. She let the walls she had built around herself crack just a little bit. The promise in his eyes, the way he held her hand like it was the only thing keeping him grounded, it was enough to make her feel like she wasn't alone in this fight. "Not anymore. I don't know what I would have done without you," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "Then don't think about it," Elian replied, his smile faint but genuine. "Think about what we're going to do next." They were interrupted by a soft click, the sudden sound of metal scraping against the walls of the tunnel. Elian's instincts kicked in, and without hesitation, he pulled Lyra behind a large piece of industrial debris just as the soft hum of Imperial drones filled the air. Their searchlights flashed through the tunnel, cutting through the darkness with an unsettling precision. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something much bigger. And now, they were finally faced with a choice. "Elian, if we keep going down this path, there's no going back," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "If we fight this fight, we're not just fighting for freedom. We're fighting for everything, for what's left of me, and for who I can become. But I don't know if I can be that person." Elian, we have to take the chance, she continued, her gaze fierce, her voice steadier now. I can't keep hiding from what I am. What they made me. But with you, maybe I can figure it out. Maybe I can choose who I want to be. Elian's heart ached at her words. He could feel the weight of her decision, the gravity of the moment pressing on both of them. But he knew this was more than just about survival. This was about freedom. Freedom not only for herself but for both of them, and for everyone who had been oppressed by the Empire. We can't change the past, Elian said, his voice low but determined. But we can choose what happens next. And I choose you us. I choose to fight for you, Lyra. I choose to fight with you. There was a pause, a moment where the world outside seemed to fade away. Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with something powerful, something that made her feel alive in a way she never had before. In that look, she saw not just a warrior beside her, but someone who truly understood her, someone who believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. With a deep breath, she nodded, her hand tightening around his. Then let's do this, she said, her voice steady now, her resolve as unshakable as his. Together, they turned toward the path ahead, ready to face whatever the Empire and the world threw at them. The battle outside had reached its climax. The city was burning, the Empire's forces flooding the streets, their weapons charged with the intent to crush any who dared defy their rule. But in the midst of it all, Elian and Lyra stood fighting side by side, hearts beating in sync. The war had escalated beyond what they had ever imagined, and now, they were in the thick of it. Elian's hand gripped the hilt of his weapon, his body moving fluidly in the chaos of battle. The soldiers fell before him, one after another, as Lyra's powers sparked beside him, her energy coursing through the air. They had become unstoppable together, two forces united by more than just survival, but by a bond forged in the fires of adversity. But even as they fought back the Empire's forces, Lyra could feel the weight of the decision she had made. There was no turning back now. The future of her people, and her own future, was on the line. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for her identity. Stay focused. Elian shouted over the sound of blasters firing, his voice carrying above the noise. Lyra's heart raced as she dodged a strike from a guard, her reflexes sharper than ever. She could feel the heat of the Empire's wrath behind her, but with Elian by her side, it didn't feel quite so overwhelming. For the first time, she felt like she was more than what they had made her. She was someone who could choose her own path. As they fought their way deeper into the heart of the city, Elian caught a glimpse of something he hadn't seen in Lyra before. There was no fear in her eyes. Only determination. I'm proud of you, he said breathlessly, his chest heaving as he fended off another soldier. Lyra didn't look at him, but her smile, though fleeting, spoke volumes. We're not done yet, she said, her voice steady as she cleared a path for them both. They pushed forward, but as they neared the Empire's central control room, something unexpected happened. A bomb detonated nearby, sending debris and dust flying through the air, separating them for a split second. Elian's heart skipped a beat. Lyra, he shouted, his voice laced with panic. But it was too late. She was gone. The world around Lyra was a blur. The explosion had knocked her to the ground, and everything spun for a few moments before she regained her bearings. She pushed herself up, her body aching, but the adrenaline running through her veins kept her moving. She couldn't stop. She had to keep going. Her mind was racing. Where was Elian? Was he okay? She scanned the battlefield, her eyes frantically searching through the smoke and chaos. Her heart skipped when she spotted him, his form silhouetted against the dust and debris. He was alive, barely standing tall amidst the destruction, but there was something wrong. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, and he looked exhausted, but the most alarming thing was the look in his eyes. He wasn't focused on the battle anymore. Lyra. Elian's voice reached her through the noise. His breath was heavy, but there was something else, a desperation that cut through the tension. Get to the control room. We can end this now. Lyra didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward him, dodging explosions and blaster fire as she went. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her with every step. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was the final stand. The Empire's reign would either continue, or it would crumble. She reached Elian, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. They locked eyes, and in that instant, the world faded away. It wasn't just about the fight. It wasn't about the Empire or the war. It was about them. It was about the life they had chosen to fight for, the freedom they had been searching for, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been oppressed. We end this now, Lyra said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Elian nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Together, they moved through the last stretch of the city, avoiding the final pockets of resistance. As they reached the control room, Elian's fingers danced across the console, quickly disabling the security systems that stood between them and their goal. In that moment, Lyra felt something shift within her. The uncertainty, the fear of who she was, all of it began to fade. She wasn't the weapon they had made her. She was more. She was free. And she would fight for that freedom, no matter what. With one final keystroke, Elian initiated the shutdown of the Empire's systems, sending a ripple through their entire network. The control room lights flickered, then went out. The city's heartbeat, its pulse, was no longer controlled by the Empire. It was over. As the smoke cleared, the sound of distant explosions began to fade, replaced by a strange, unsettling silence. Lyra stood at the center of the control room, her breath steady, her eyes fixed on Elian. He stepped toward her, his expression serious but filled with something else, something she couldn't quite describe. He stopped just inches away from her, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's over," he said softly, almost to himself. Lyra nodded, the weight of it all slowly sinking in. The fight was over, but this was just the beginning. There was a world out there, a future to rebuild. "What now?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with curiosity. Elian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, the touch warm, reassuring. "Now, we rebuild. We figure out what we're going to do with the freedom we've earned." Lyra smiled, a genuine smile this time. She had always been driven by a need to survive, to escape. But now, with Elian by her side, she realized there was so much more to life than that. She could choose who she wanted to be, what she wanted to stand for. She could choose love, freedom, and a future. Elian smiled back, his hand gently sliding down her arm until his fingers intertwined with hers. In that moment, there was no more uncertainty. There was only the certainty of them and whatever came next. Together, they walked out of the control room, hand in hand. The dawn of a new world was on the horizon, and for the first time, Lyra felt like she was ready to face it. The dust has settled. The echoes of battle fade away. And for a moment, it's just the two of them standing amidst the ruins, the remnants of everything they fought for. but in the silence that follows, one question still lingers. What's next? Lyra and Elian have fought for freedom, for the right to love beyond borders, beyond the stars. But even in victory, there's still uncertainty. There's still the question, will it last? Can love true, defiant, impossible love survive the impossible? As they stand there, hand in hand, looking at the wreckage around them, I'm left to wonder, are we truly free? Or did we just exchange one set of chains for another? Their journey together has only just begun. A new chapter. A new world. But with every new dawn comes a new question, how far are we willing to go for love? And now, as the camera pulls away and the stars blink down upon us, a new message crackles through the silence. A voice not of Elian, not of Lyra, but of someone or something else, saying only one thing, this is not the end. It's just the beginning. Intergalactic Hearts will take you to places you've never dreamed of, beyond the stars, beyond reality itself. Don't let the story end here. Subscribe now, because the journey is just getting started. Will you be ready when it all comes crashing down?